You are now leading this extraordinarily big company. How do you think of yourself as a leader now? How did you think about your role on the inspiration side as a leader? This is a really important time. How do you deal with that?
Welcome to No Turning Back, a podcast hosted by General Stan McChrystal and myself, Chris Fussell. Our goal here is simple: to have serious conversations with serious leaders so that we can learn from the best and navigate these complex times together. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, so welcome to 2021, which couldn't be a more interesting year, and I'm sure we'll be on a more positive track here soon. And so Stan and Crystal and I just wanted to take a bit of time here at the beginning of the year and reflect on all the amazing discussions we've had on No Turning Back in 2020. We asked for questions from listeners out there, got some amazing feedback, and so we're going to get through as many as we can in the next 40 minutes or so. And so, Stan, I'll start by pushing over to you with the first one, and we'll get specific out of the gates and then maybe go more broad. So a question from Anelia Fari, which is, what are your biggest lessons from 2020 guests on No Turning Back? And how did any of the conversations change how you think about leadership? So why don't you kick us off?
Well, thanks, Chris. And we have gotten a good start to the year, knock on wood so far. We had a number of really interesting conversations, but the one that really caught my mind was Jamil Farshchi. And he's the Information Security Officer, Chief Information Security Officer for Equifax. And he's got a history in cybersecurity. And you start to think, okay, this is a technical area where you bring in an expert and he solves your problem. But that's not actually how cybersecurity has to work in today's world. The danger of siloing off the cybersecurity head in a separate building or in a separate office and bringing them in at certain times really ignores the fact that we are now digital in everything we do. We are dependent upon it for every part of our business. It's no longer a tool we use. It is a backbone upon which everything we do operates. So in reality, the security, which isn't a wall at the outside of your organization, in fact, it's a series of processes and a culture inside the organization, becomes critical. That means the head of information security has got to be part of the organization. And what they say and do has got to be part of the DNA. We've just been writing a book on risk. And one of the things we studied was the failure of Lehman Brothers. And one of the things they did was they created a chief risk officer, and then they put that risk officer down in the structure of the organization, didn't invite them to important meetings, didn't include them in critical decisions. And so in reality, they had checked a box saying, we have a chief risk officer, but they weren't really part of the decision-making process. So in reality, they moral licensed is the term. They'd said, you've got that person who's responsible for risk, and if they don't stop us, it's okay. And yet the organization operated in a way that incurred huge risk. And so when I listened to Jamil, and to be honest, we've become friends since I was talking on the phone last week, particularly with the new SolarWinds hack, it's got to be in everything we do, every way we think, almost like you lock your car, you lock your house, you watch out for your kids. It's just got to be in our mind. And that is a big difference from people who grew up in earlier generations.
Yeah, that was a great discussion. And it reminded me of, Jamil, obviously the risk work that you've been doing over the past year, and even back to the counterterrorism world, where it took a while for those of us down in the ranks to realize there's not these big moments of risk, it's all these little elements, and somebody somewhere is seeing something you should know about, right? And so when Jamil was talking, I was thinking of sort of the aha moments of, hey, what if we asked that like 21-year-old kid watching the pred feeds all day, the overhead sensor stuff, because that was always, and he or she would turn around and say, hey, that's the same car that was there last week. And they would say it quietly in the corner like 20 times and no one would ever hear them until you realized that's a person that can mitigate or see opportunity. And so it really does come down to connecting those people.
As you know, Chris, I was on the board of JetBlue for a number of years, and I was the head of the risk committee. And safety committee. And of course, that deals with the risk to how the airline operates. Of course, the worst thing that can happen to an airline is they have an accident in which lives are lost. It's of course tragic from that standpoint, and business-wise, it can be catastrophic as well. But what you find out about safety in an airline is it's all about culture. Every flight, every day, every procedure has risks and threats and potential safety violations built in. And when they do have investigations of big accidents, they typically find a whole host of things that have been going on for quite a long time that nobody said anything about. And they built up. So it's very rarely that one big causal factor. It's a culture that doesn't watch out for it.
I would, there's so many great conversations this year. The one that comes top of mind for me is Senator Joe Manchin. As you well know, my wife and I and our kids are big fans of the state of West Virginia and all it has to offer. And Senator Manchin was very generous with his time. The one thing that jumped out or stuck with me from that conversation was something I knew about but never heard him describe. Some folks may not know this, but in DC, Senator Manchin uses a houseboat for his residents, or it used to be a houseboat. Now it's more of a regular boat, just down in like the Navy Yard area, for those that know DC. And he uses it as this neutral territory to pull together folks from different sides of the aisle. I mean, he's unfortunately a bit of an outlier in finding the middle ground in the way the national politics works these days. But he still has this great practice of getting people to a neutral territory, on a boat, on the water, which everybody has to admit is beautiful, sort of troll around, watch the sunset, whatever the case may be, in order to make them realize, hey, we're all just people, and we're out here on this boat, and let's have a beer and have a conversation about how we can really fix things. And it really made me reflect back to the way that the headquarters you'd established in Iraq and then Afghanistan ultimately was leveraged for a similar purpose. When I was your aide, I'd watch, civilian leaders from different military units, et cetera, come to that headquarters. And your particular piece of that, your office, so to speak, was separate from the combat headquarters, just by 50 yards. But it was more of a global sort of neutral space where you could dial in and say, look, you want to understand what's going on the war and terror around the world. Here's sort of the epicenter of the information flow. And you're welcome to sit here and listen and be part of the conversation, et cetera. And I watched these very, very sort of hard opinion people on wherever they may view the conflict, after 24 hours sitting in that environment, realize, hey, this is all just people working really hard trying to figure out a very complex problem. And they'd walk away shaking hands and understanding the units better, et cetera. And finding that sort of terrain where you can get people to sit back and reflect and get out of their sort of partisan opinion or their very dogmatic view on how the organization should be run, et cetera, is really an art. So I thought Manchin brought that out really well.
It's also the humanity of it. I remember when I first I had met him before, Joe Manchin, but he wanted me to do something a couple of years ago. And so he invited me to dinner on his boat. And so I went to dinner, just me, and he had takeout Italian food. And so it was very unpretentious. And it's not a big lavish boat. It's comfortable, but it's not lavish. And you just have a one-on-one. And his theory of life is that there's something good in everyone. Now, I know a few people who sort of push that theory to the edge, but the reality is his willingness to start from that assumption and then try to find common ground is extraordinarily powerful. And you just want to do things for and with a leader like that. And the fact that it's not a popular leadership technique right now doesn't mean it's not the way we ought to be operating. And so I found him fascinating.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Hoping 2021 brings more of that type of thinking for all of us. Okay, next question. Thanks for that previous one, Anelia. Next question is from Clayton Felkler. This is very, very broad, high level. What has been your most surprising leadership lesson throughout your career?
Yeah, Clayton, it's a little bit disappointing, and that is that effective leadership is not at all related to moral or good leadership. And what I mean is some of the most effective leaders that I've either studied or actually dealt with actually were trying to do things that were abhorrent. One of the most effective leaders that I dealt closely with was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. In fact, we killed him. But for 2.5 years of my life, I was fixated on fighting against him and us finding him. And yet he was extraordinarily effective. He was charismatic. He was energetic. He got things done. And so there were a number of terrorist leaders that exhibited almost all of the traits that we ascribe to effective leaders. They can connect with people. They are representative of the kinds of values that inspire people and those sorts of things. And the hard part of this lesson is you realize just how powerful leadership is. An effective leader can lead otherwise good people to a very negative place. And so we've got to understand that leadership is not necessarily a good thing. It is a thing, and it is good if it's used for good.
Yeah, I think I would answer in a similar way. Having never led at the strategic level like you did in the military, but watching it, being a student of it, where our McChrystal Group has been positioned to learn alongside some amazing leaders in industry, and the conversations we've had with our class at Yale over the years as well has evolved my thinking to the point about leadership, where I try to tell people it is a much harder choice than you think it might be. If you really want to be a leader, hopefully you're wired to leverage it for good, but don't do it for the glory. And I'll repeat something we've talked about before on No Turning Back, but when we talk about with our students at Yale, we'll often reflect on Abraham Lincoln, and we'll spend a class or two or more just talking about his brilliance in pulling together a disparate cabinet of different thinkers from across the aisle, but then try to get them to at the end of the discussion, think about Lincoln in his final days, and he's physically and mentally exhausted. He's in an economically difficult position. He's suffered greatly. His family suffered greatly, and then he dies. And it's not a heroic ending, and he was probably exhausted at the end of a really bad day, at the end of a really bad week, when he gets shot in the head, right? And that in Lincoln's position, that's how things came to an end. He had no idea if it was going to turn out well, et cetera. We like to remember the Lincoln on the National Mall and the brilliance that we've studied for generations now. But did he really see that, right? And so the question is, if you want to be a leader, are you willing to make that sacrifice? Are you willing to live that difficult of a life just because you believe what you're doing is for the better of humanity? Or do you want to see the statue while you're still alive? That's two very different paths. And so it's a much harder practice than people understand. And I've only learned that over the last 10 or 15 years.
Wow. And that's extraordinarily powerful, but true.
So maybe we'll find something lighter here. For a question from Mark Butler. We are in a politically polarized moment right now, maybe not too much lighter. Lots of ways in which we're divided as a society. How does a corporate leader keep their team focused and unified and not divided by what is going on outside of the company?
Chris, you want to start?
Sure, I'll dive in on that. I think McChrystal Group, like any other organization, had to figure this out early in the year. And so one of the reflections I've shared with others, we pivoted our organization in some really positive ways, came through it stronger, I would argue, and on the whole for having dealt with this together. And one of the mantras I personally stole from life in the military early in the year was, and to maintain that focus was, hey, the beauty of being surrounded is you can shoot in any direction, right? We're all in trouble right now. Just figure out something and get some momentum going, and we'll solve things as we move together as a team. So I personally think that the best way that I've found, especially during a year like this, to keep a team focused and not distracted by the politics is, A, you can't ignore it. Obviously, this is a tumultuous time on so many different levels. You have to address it, but you can't let it become the core issue. You have to remember, look, we're a team. We're going to move together in unison in support of what our collective mission is. And that's not politics. It's not social change. That's something that's important to all of us in different ways, for sure. So we want to create an organization where we can talk about those things, but it can't become the distraction that our organization suffers as a result of. Because if there's no organization, there's no jobs. If there's no us, right? And this whole thing falls apart. So we have to, we steal a mantra from the Navy as our sort of core cultural traits here at McChrystal Group, which is shipmate self. You have to protect the ship first. The ship sinks, all the shipmates die, and you're one of them, right? So that I think has gotten us through some pretty tough times here.
Yeah, I would say, Chris, watching you, I've learned a lot on this, because if you have political views, but if somebody wanted to know your political views, they'd have to ask you. And presumably they'd have to be somebody comfortable enough to ask you your views. They don't have to ask you your values, because your values are evident in the way you act every day, both as a friend and as a comrade in the organization, the decisions you make. And when we talk about things, you'll say, I think this because of this. And so your values are right there. And people might try to say, well, because of those values, I can guess it is politics. No, it doesn't really matter, because the values are what matters to us as organizations and as comrades to each other. The politics, as you're right, they get to be a distraction, and they can almost make us forget that the values are what we're really trying to be about.
Yeah, and I think we could all. I hope we can see some change just in the national conversation on that front. Lead with common ground, not with points of division. This is a different direction, but it's a fun question from Zach Lois. What changes would you make to the American public education system?
Yeah, there are sometimes conversations had that don't understand that really the American public education system changed dramatically at the beginning of the 19th century or 20th century, when suddenly a high school diploma became an expectation. And that was a massive change, and it changed us societally because it suddenly gave us a much better workforce, a much greater sense of equality. Not perfect, but it was a great step forward for public education. I think the next great step that we should make in the United States is creating an expectation of service to the nation. There was a time when, during big wars, the First World War, the Second World War, that en masse, young men primarily were called into uniform service, but ladies as well went into the service, but of course into the workforce is huge. And it was an expectation that you would be responsible to the larger society. I think we've lost a lot of that, partly because we've stopped asking people to do that. And another reason is we've stopped honoring and rewarding it. And so I think it would be a time to bring back the idea of national service, that every young person coming up when they become of age, 18, and do it in a period between 18 and 28, they all do at least a year of full-time national service. Now, not necessarily in uniform. It can be in education, healthcare, the environment. There's so many things that need to be done, but less important than the things that need to be done would be the impact on the participants. Because whenever you've committed, invested in something, you have a greater sense of ownership to it and responsibility for it. And I think that would change our relationship with our nation, change our relationship with our fellow citizens. And it would also give us a reason to do a lot of other things we want to do. We want to make college easier for young people to access. And rather than just giving them something for nothing, give them education benefits as a result of their service. There's so many things we can tie to this that tie us to making our society stronger. So I think there's a great opportunity here, and I think the time has come for us to to take a really hard look and move in that direction.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you to build on a little bit, because you've had so many conversations over the last decade about that with people that are in a position to really drive it as an agenda, and would be curious what gets in the way there. And I agree with you. I spent in the early, before 9/11, when I was in the SEAL teams, we spent time working with the Swedish Special Forces, and Sweden's gone through phases of conscription and not. But the generation of folks that I was working with had all been conscripts. But at age 18, spent 1 year in the military, and we were in the Capitol, and we went to the King's, sort of historic, their version of Buckingham Palace, right? Not really the home of the king, but still an historic place. And there's great ceremony around it every day. And they were pointing out the guards around the castle that were all in their, very, very fancy uniforms, etc. And they said those are all conscripts. All the guards around the castle, which is a historic site, are all conscripts. And every conscript's unit does that for 1 day during their year. So every person in Sweden of a certain age has spent 1 day guarding the king's castle. And it just sends this powerful message. And everybody has this, and the Swedish unit that we were working with all were laughing and telling stories about their day, because all the units kind of goof around. They have a big party afterwards. And it's just this one unifying thing that the whole country has done. You're talking about a much more elaborate sort of approach, but we undervalue those touchstones that pull people together as a society. Why do you think it doesn't get more traction?
There have been some muscles that have atrophied over time because we went to an all-volunteer military, and because we didn't have a CCC, because we haven't had a Great Depression, things like that. There weren't causes that brought so many people. Plus things like volunteer fire departments and all have increasingly professionalized. So Americans have started to think of citizenship, the responsibilities, as pay your taxes and vote, and you've checked the block. When in reality, our history was the opposite. Our history was common defense, barn raising, all the things that have to make a society work. Plus we're mobile now. We tend to grow up in one neighborhood, live in another in our working years, and retire in yet another, which means you don't even have the same connection to the school system when you're retired, because your kids and grandkids aren't in it where you live. So there are a number of things that have made it harder to hold on to. The rise of labor unions are sometimes concerned about programs like this. A professional military worries about going back to conscription. And then there are other people that think that everything ought to be done with volunteerism. The reality, though, is I think most of those concerns really pale in comparison to the value of what you described. Everybody guarding the king's palace at some point in their life, suddenly understanding that on this given day, I am doing this very important job. And for the rest of their lives, they did that important job. And when they are at a party later, if you can look at each other and go, where did you serve? Or what day did you serve? And you have something that starts. And if we could start with young Americans meeting on a train and saying, where'd you do your service? Knowing that the other person was going to have an answer. You wouldn't ask that now because you'd embarrass them. I like the idea, and I describe to people sometimes, if a young person decides to run for Congress, one of the questions they ought to be asked publicly of them is, where did you serve? What was the nature of your service? And if they couldn't answer the question, then it ought to be a very embarrassed silence and say, bring me the next candidate. Mm-hmm. And I think that we need to understand it's about the people. It's about citizens. That's the most important product we ever produce in a country. If our citizens are good enough, there's no problem we can't solve. If the citizens aren't up to it, our infrastructure, everything else will not help us a bit.
Yeah. What comes to mind, I agree wholeheartedly with the national service approach. I would add in I'm a big believer in the outdoors for challenging people, as you know. And you get a lot of this exposure in the military that you just take for granted as a young person in the military. And for those that are listening that haven't heard us talk about this before, inside McChrystal Group, in normal years, 2020 obviously being an exception, we 3 or 4 times a year would execute what we call a leadership venture. And it's an internal investment. We'll take anywhere from a dozen to low 20s people from our organization, and they'll go spend time together in a relatively challenging outdoor environment. We've taken groups to Yosemite to do big, huge hikes up mountains. We've gone taking folks on climbing trips, sailing trips, anything to put people in situations that are not easy to figure out. There's a little bit of adversity, a little bit of physical and mental challenge, and you've got to solve it, right? You're in a sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, the wind's blowing, you got to figure out how you're going to take care of things, right? And what that does to create that sense of unity, self-confidence, team orientation, et cetera, it's really hard to replicate anywhere else in my view. And I've always believed that it was a cool thing, but as people come spend time at McChrystal Group and 3 or 4 years later go on to another part of their career, more people that I can remember have said that was the number one most important thing about their time at the group, which is a consulting firm. You're like, well, that's surprising. But it's life-changing for some people who haven't had those opportunities before. So I think you could incorporate more of that into public education, allowing young folks to get out and experience what they can do themselves in a more difficult environment than they might find in the classroom.
It can be pretty funny too. I went out to Shenandoah Valley for an orienteering weekend, and it was wickedly cold. So there was another reason to want to get through the course, and we were broken into 4-person teams. And every team either had a SEAL or an Army Ranger or somebody with some experience. And the team members immediately look to you and assume, okay, woodsman, we're good to go. We got no problem. I think all of us at some point or another got lost. And it was funny because the young people would turn and look at you and they go, oh, wait a minute. You're supposed to be Daniel Boone here, big guy. And we had people going through swamps. My wife was out there with us, and she was shimmying across a log, cussing at the military guy that was on her team. So it's another good reminder that we can all be humbled a little bit by things like nature. And that's a good connection. It's a joke forevermore between team members.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think, when I take a climbing crew from our firm on a climbing trip, I always try to include my family in it. And in a similar way, for newer members of an organization to watch, your 12-year-old daughter, tell you what's what. It's humanizing. Like, okay, these are normal people. I kind of like that in a team environment, that level of, hey, we all get lost in the woods. It's hard. Right? The question is, are you going to get back down and figure it out? Right. So a shift here to some organizational stuff, more specific questions around what we do as a firm, what we've seen in the industry space. First is sort of driving the question of how do you drive change? So this is from Osborne Brown. And the question is, how do you lead people through change when they don't believe there's a problem or they like the status quo? And we see this all the time. So maybe Stan, if you want to start it.
Sure. Yeah. And we experienced this together in the war in Iraq, but we had this very elite organization that was performing on an operational level very effectively, but not accomplishing the overall mission because the conditions were changed. Our opponent was different than anything we'd faced before. The first thing you have to do is admit that you're failing. And that's harder than it seems, because the first thing you do is you say, we're not failing, we're actually doing better, and that wasn't the case. But then there's another result where you say it's somebody else's fault, so we don't have to change. You got to get past those, and that takes leadership. But the second thing you have to do is everybody's got to see the problem the same way. And in most organizations, the way information flows, it's the blind man and the elephant. Everybody sees their part of the elephant. So what we had to do is create what we call shared consciousness, and we did it through a big daily video teleconference with the entire command, 7,500 people. So they all saw the big picture every day, and that was important because when they all saw what was happening across the battlefield, then suddenly there was a logic to the fact that we needed to change. If you were just down in your narrow part, it was harder to make the argument because people are pretty narrowly focused. We were able to bring that up, and it did two things. It, one, informed them of the need to change. It made a compelling argument for that. And second, it also gave them appreciation for what kind of changes were necessary. And in some cases, it may mean their part of the organization surrendered resources to another part so we could make higher priority change in the moment. And that made people have a larger view and a better way to create teamwork.
Yeah, and I'm going to build on that and just pivot to a connected question from James Aiken. And the question is, when transitioning from a traditional model to a team of teams model, what are typically the most difficult parts for a senior leader to adjust to from the old to the new? And you've hit on some of that, and I'll sort of break it down into the three layers that we talk about regularly with organizations, not just at the senior level, but mid management and then frontline folks. And we felt the same thing in the military, at least I did personally. Senior leadership, if they're having the conversation, they're bringing in a group like ours in to do some work, they get it. At least they know all the things Stan was just talking about. So directionally, we understand we've got to start moving towards something new. But then their challenge generally comes with that level of exposure, that transparency. I've got to be in front of this group daily, weekly, whatever that cadence is going to look like. I'm not going to know the right answers because we're communicating too fast. I don't have time to read all the materials and walk onto stage and sound brilliant every single time. And so that level of exposure can create a tension, right? And then they work through it quickly when they realize, oh, wow, everyone here is trying to work together hard to solve these problems. At the mid-level, the tension is sort of immediate, where they say, I'm incentivized in the middle of the organization to keep the traffic flow between senior leaders and frontline leaders organized. And so if they can communicate directly, what's my role? And there's some tension there, and you have to convince them, look, as more transparent models are put in place, like the daily sync that you were just talking about, creating that sense of shared consciousness, that mid-management becomes the prime position folks to create those sub-networks, because they can see up and down clearer than anyone else. So they can listen to the senior leadership and know, hey, here are the three teams on the ground that need to connect to solve that. And so their lives actually become way more interesting and engaging than a normal bureaucracy. And then the front line, it's sort of the inverse of the senior leadership. They think this is great. And I know I went through this as a tactical leader in the military. This is great. We're going to get like all the toys and all the empowerment, et cetera. And you forget about the accountability. Well, you're also going to be every single day have a flashlight on you in front of thousands of people. And so your excuse matrix is gone, right? The way I describe it to frontline folks is your senior leaders are suddenly going to be able to see, which they can't in most organizations, when you're choosing not to do things. They can always see when you get things wrong. They can always see your successes. In a team of teams model, they can see when you knew enough, but you decided not to take action, which I think ties back to all the risk work you've been doing this past year in the forthcoming book. In one part of that is it's all those little inactions in today's world that lead to potentially existential risk, because it's not my fault on the ground. You're eventually going to own all these little moments of indecision, and now the whole organization's at risk. So that's kind of the three levels of behavior change that it tends to drive.
It's so different for many leaders as well, because you grew up watching leaders that you have then ascended to replace them, and you're going to have to behave differently than they did. And it's very frustrating because you saw that person and you may have seen them closely enough to say, I know what they did. She did XXX. I'm doing all that. Why am I not succeeding? And that can create a lot of angst in the part of leaders. But you got to get over it. It's nobody's fault. The environment changed, and you are leading in a different environment.
Well, and I think that's probably a good question to wrap on. I mean, that's what all of us are going to face going into 2021, right? We got to figure out how we're going to lead differently as we work back to some sort of steady state that's not going to be like 2019. So I think that's a great way to wrap this discussion. Really appreciate everyone that sent in some thoughts. We'll do this more periodically throughout 2021, and we're looking forward to some great conversations in the weeks and months ahead.
It's going to be a great year.